everybody. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Christian Hart to the show this morning. He's here to help us understand the psychology of liars and lying, a topic much on our mind these days in the week of the news about George Santos' jaw-dropping dissembling. His lies have been so plentiful and so easily proven to be lies that we're left pondering the psychology of such a chronic and seemingly unrepentant compulsive deceiver. Dr. Hart is the perfect person to guide us to a better understanding of this phenomenon. Chris is a professor of psychology at Texas Women's University, where he's director of the psychological science program, as well as the director of the Human Deception Laboratory. He holds a master's and a Ph.D. in experimental psychology, and he's the author of 2 books on lying, along with his co-author, Dr. Drew Curtis. The first book is Pathological Lying, Theory, Research, and Practice, an American Psychological Association publication that came out in 2022. And he also is the author of Big Liars, What Psychological Science Tells Us About Lying and How You Can Avoid Being Duped. That will be forthcoming in August of this year, also from the American Psychological Association. Chris, first off, just welcome to the morning show. Thank you for taking time to be here.
Well, thanks for having me, Mary. I'm really excited to be here.
Oh, it's totally my pleasure. Well, I was hoping, Chris, that we might start. Could you tell us just what got you interested in studying the psychology of lying in the first place?
Yeah, sure. Well, when I was in graduate school, I had a professor who studied deception and did some consulting work with the CIA and things like that. That always sounded interesting to me. But at the time, I was more interested in neuroscience. So I was studying how the brain works and just peripherally interested in deception. But probably about 15 years ago, I had a student who was interested in conducting some research on deception. And so through that process, I got more involved. And then as the research progressed, my interest really started to focus on those people who seem to lie a lot, because what we were finding in our research was, most people lie. If we ask people over a week, how many lies have you told? 95% of people will admit to telling at least one. But if we look a little bit more closely, we find that while most people are mostly honest most of the time, there's this small subset of people, usually around 5% of the population, that tell an enormous amount of lies. And so anytime we see any trait or characteristic at its extremes, whether it's athletic ability or intelligence, or something else, I think it needs to grab our attention. And it did for me.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. So, we all lie some of the time, but some of us specialize, in other words. If they're the bell curve, they're the outlier on that. That's really interesting. And we do lie, Chris, of course. We talk about white lies, and some of us lie sometimes to make ourselves look a little bit better or to save somebody else's feelings. But George Santos has been in the news, I think, largely because this magnitude of his lies, like that 5%, is just cosmically larger than the universe of lying most of us are familiar with from our own lives. And there's been, therefore, much commentary about George Santos, including this morning, when it turns out he's, rather than being repentant, he's starting to raise funds to rerun again in 2024, which is astonishing to some of us. And in the commentary, many people have referred to George Santos as a pathological liar. Some have even called him a sociopath. Mitt Romney called him a sick puppy, but I don't think that's in the diagnostic manual. Perhaps you could help us understand how lies like those of George Santos do or don't fit either of these clinical diagnostic categories of either pathological lying or sociopathy.
Okay. Well, you're right that we all lie, and our lies tend to be, when we do tell them, they tend to be fairly minimal, so slight exaggerations. Yeah. We generally, when we need to lie, we do the least amount of lying necessary to accomplish the goal we're trying to accomplish, whether it's leaving someone's boring dinner party early or offering an excuse for a missed deadline or something along those lines. And so when we look at terms like sociopathy or psychopathy or pathological lying, we do see a departure from normal lying. And so when we're talking about pathological lying, really what we're talking about is lying that is maladaptive. And so what we mean by maladaptive is it's causing problems.
Yeah.
And so usually this is from very excessive lying, so someone lying much more than the average person, but sometimes it's just the character of the lie. They're lying about extremely significant and substantive matters that causes massive disruption in the lives of people around them. And so when we talk about sociopaths and psychopaths, really what we're talking about is people who are extremely manipulative, who use other people and essentially see other people as pawns in their ambitions to get what they want. And so these people tend to lack anxiety about their lying. They tend to be impulsive, and their lying tends to play out without any sense of remorse or guilt. And so if we think of psychopathy, we can usually think of excessive lying. It's just one of the tools that psychopaths or sociopaths use to get what they want. Now, when we look at pathological lying, and the way we talk about it in our book is we're talking about not people who are necessarily extremely manipulative, but we look at the lying in isolation. And so we suggest a diagnosis of pathological lying is simply someone who has lying that is so excessive that it causes disruption and dysfunction in their lives and their relationships and their workplace, oftentimes causes them bad feelings. They're distressed about how much they're lying, and then the lying to a certain degree is compulsive, or they feel like it's a bit out of their control.
Yeah. It almost, when you talk about those categories of lying, it makes me think about addiction, because somebody who is an alcoholic or addicted to other substances, one of the ways we think about that is that it's extremely disruptive. It's maladaptive. It's destructive in their own life, to their careers, their work life, their relationship. And it sounds as though what you're saying is somewhat analogous to the impact that this type of extreme lying has on the lives of the lying liars, I guess you could say, Chris. Well, thank you for that. That's really helpful to make those distinctions. I wanted to ask you, so for people who lie excessively, what does your research suggest about the personality types that are most prone to do so? And could you give us some examples of these personality types?
Sure. When we look at liars, so we've done numerous studies where we collect data from hundreds and hundreds of people, and we measure them on personality traits and demographic variables and all sorts of things. And one of the best predictors of someone being an excessive liar is their age. What we find is that people start lying at about the age of 2 or 3, and any parent knows that around then their kids start lying, and that lying tends to peak in late adolescence. And then for most people, the trajectory is then for lying to fall off and become kind of normal as we move into adulthood. But moving past age, one of the significant personality predictors of excessive lying is a moral commitment to the truth. And so most of us feel morally attached to being honest, but that's not true of everyone. And so when we ask people about their moral commitment to the truth, we find that some people have kind of a loose attachment to those types of ethical commitments, and those people tend to lie excessively. Essentially, when we look at lying, people lie when there is a motivation or an incentive to lie. That is, they think they can get something out of it. They think they're not going to get caught, or if they get caught, the consequences will be fairly tolerable. But then the biggest thing is they can morally justify their lying. And so for most of us, we don't lie much, even when we have the opportunity to do so, because we don't want to be a liar. We don't view ourselves as dishonest people. But some people don't have that type of restraint. Ironically, some other factors that influence excessive lying are compassion. So some people feel so compassionate or so worried about hurting other people's feelings that they'll use deceit to kind of smooth over any kind of friction or a disruption in a social interaction. And so you can think of the white lies where we tell someone that their haircut looks great even when we think that it does. Some people really take that to the extreme. Other variables are most people are fairly agreeable. That is, we like to be in cooperative relationships with others. Not so much for some people. And so people who are kind of low in that agreeableness or cooperativeness are much more inclined to be the big liars in our studies. And then we have kind of the dark features of personality as well. And so you might be familiar with like the dark triad. So people who are Machiavellian, that is, they are extremely manipulative and kind of see life as a chess game where they're the sole actor using other people as pawns to get what they want. Those people are more inclined to lie. Narcissistic people who need to be viewed as a step above everyone else, they'll oftentimes lie to place themselves in a higher status position. And then psychopaths, people who exploit others, they obviously are going to use deception to accomplish that. At the core of all those dark traits, though, is essentially an orientation where people place their own interests above everyone else. So that's kind of the key. And then the other big part is this idea that they can morally justify what they're doing. So I see what my goals is much more important than everyone else's, and I'm fine doing whatever it takes to get those.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting and helpful, Chris. So it's a range of different personality features, but what they all have in common somehow are a few things. One is this lack of a commitment to wanting to see the truth as an essential moral good that one wants to adhere to, and or a kind of an egocentric feeling that, well, yeah, I lied, but it's important to me to get what I want, and I deserve to get what I want, and so I'm justified in lying. But there's also that interesting phenomenon that you identified of sometimes an excess of compassion or sensitivity to others' feelings, or not wanting to be perceived as being insensitive, can lead people to excessively lie by trying to appear, by soothing other people's egos, really. That's really interesting. Thank you for that, Chris.
Sure.
I am interested in the shamelessness part of it, because most of us wouldn't lie if we thought we would be found out easily or quickly. And yet there are people, and this is, I think, why George Santos had particularly baffled people. People often comment, but it's so easy to find out that you didn't go to Baruch College. It's so easy to find out your mother was in Brazil when the towers came down. And so I'm curious to ask you a little bit more about how do liars and big liars live with themselves, because people are hurt by lies very often. Like the voters of Nassau County, for example, they voted for someone, it turned out, who was a big fraud, and now they're stuck with him maybe for 2 years. So do liars, excessive liars, just have no shame? How does that work?
Well, I think there's two features worth considering. So one is people who lie excessively tend to be rather impulsive. And so they might not fully think through the consequences of what they're doing. And they lie based on their immediate circumstances. So it'll be difficult for me to say the truth right now. They don't think through, well, what's going to happen when people detect what the truth actually is a week or a month from now. So that impulsivity, I think, can account for some of it. But we also see that liars are risk takers. The big liars that we've measured tend to take risks. And so they might think to themselves, there's a chance I might get caught, but boy, I might get away too. And so that willingness to roll the dice is probably part of it. But I think when you're talking about shame and guilt, when we look at many of these big liars, we find that in addition to lying a lot, they have these other traits of psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. And these are people that exploit others and have very little remorse or guilt about it. And so, they'll lie to your face, and when you catch them, they don't really feel bad about it. And so that is a social pressure that dramatically affects most people's behavior. We are extremely concerned about our reputations. And so anything that might harm our reputation, and cause people to view us in a negative light, we tend to avoid those behaviors. But with these people with antisocial personality disorder and evidence of psychopathy, that concern doesn't seem to loom large in their psychology.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's kind of a gap. You might almost call it an empathy gap, because part of what we're concerned about when we were concerned about our reputations is people will see us as having done harm, having hurt other people, and we can identify with what that feels like, and so we want to avoid that. And some of the people that you're describing, then they don't have that experience, so they're walled off from it for different reasons. Well, one of the things I also wanted to ask you about, Chris, was a lot of liars go undetected for a really long time. I mean, usually, maybe not always, but often the truth comes out eventually. And I believe that in your forthcoming book, you talk about some big liars, really big liars, like Bernie Madoff and Elizabeth Holmes. I think Anna Sorokin, because of Netflix, is now a very famous big liar. What makes it so hard much of the time for us to detect even big lies?
Well, we're all pretty good at lying, or at least most of us are. And we know this is true because if we ask people about their own lying, they offer that they usually get away with their lies. That is, they believe I'm being undetected. And, if we all think about our own lies, they tend to be pretty small and inconsequential. And we tell them and life moves on and no one ever catches us or questions us about them. But we do, and then when we bring people into the laboratory, we can see evidence that lying is just really hard to detect, at least relying on body cues and facial expressions and things like that. So if we bring people into the laboratory and we show them videos of people who are lying or telling the truth, and we ask them to discern who's lying and who's telling the truth, we find that they perform at just slightly above chance levels. So if you think like 50% would be chance levels, they typically perform around 53 or 54% accuracy. And what this tells us is that most people are really good at lying, and most of us are horrible at lie detection. This is even true for people who detect lies for a living. So when we measure police detectives, we see that they are no better than college students at detecting who's telling the truth. So people can get away with lies, but when we talk about detecting lying, the way that lies are most often detected is when we discover evidence of the deceit. And usually that evidence comes in the form of conflicting evidence coming from the person. It's like, well, wait a minute, you said you were at this party last night, but then you just said you were asleep. What's the truth? And so, or we get confirmation from third parties. So someone tells you that they were at a location, and then you have other witnesses that say that no, they absolutely weren't there. And so that's how we actually detect lying. And so as a consequence, if we're not going to be digging up the truth and using George Santos as an example, when he wasn't in office, people didn't really care that much about him. And so they weren't doing the digging. But once he's elected, reporters really start digging into the story and start discovering that much of his biography is fraudulent. But I guess looking more broadly at why we don't detect liars or big liars is we're prone to believe. Most people are honest most of the time. Most people are cooperative with us. And so we go into most social situations with the belief that what is being said to us is the truth. We call the truth default. We only deviate out of that truth default when we detect something strange or something suspicious, or if we see that maybe there's an incentive for someone to be dishonest. So if you're trying to buy a used car, you might be rightly suspicious that because of the salesperson's incentives, they might not be fully honest with you. So those are some of the reasons that we're pretty poor at detecting lying.
Well, I like that phrase, the truth default, because it kind of sums up the situation that we're in, and that we're predisposed to to live with the truth default until or unless there's either a context, like a used car lot, that tells us we need to pay attention, or there's some kind of evidence, like a photograph. Yeah, especially these days with social media and iPhone cameras everywhere, where lies can be detected because there's some objective evidence or proof, or a third party tells us. So, caveat emptor, Chris. I did want to ask you about another phenomenon that we've been reading about, especially during the former president's years, because the Washington Post, for example, their fact checker discovered that the former president made more than 30,000 false or misleading statements during his 4 years in office. And of course, millions and millions of people still fervently believe the big lie about the 2020 election. And I've heard, I mean, without any evidence, by the way, and with more than 60 court decisions coming, showing that the claims were not true. But I've heard that we humans are predisposed to believe lies if they're simply repeated over and over and over again. And this baffles me a little. I'm hoping you can help me understand it better. It seems counterintuitive to me, because arguably if someone lies and then they keep lying and they keep lying, my response might be, I can't believe anything you say. Because you either don't know the difference between a lie and the truth, or you think I'm stupid. And yet this has been, I think the research shows that this is an effect, that it happens, that repetition of a lie over and over again tends to lead people to really believe the lie and to take it for the truth. Chris, help me understand this.
Okay, so what you're talking about, social psychologists refer to it as the illusory truth effect. And that is the idea that if a claim is made repeatedly, we believe it more and more the more often it's repeated. And that's whether it's a truth or a lie. Now, it is the case that if we have evidence that something's a lie, that claim being repeated over and over again doesn't cause us to start believing it. But what happens in most cases is we have very ambiguous evidence about whether something is truthful or not. We're oftentimes taking people's words for it. And if we have conflicting evidence, then the more we hear it, we perceive it as more evidence. It's said again and again, therefore it must be the more correct of two claims that are being made. Now, so when you talk about politicians lying repeatedly, and do we start to believe their lies? And people oftentimes mention the case of President Trump. People engage in motivated reasoning, and so I have a belief I want to be true, and I'm going to selectively look for evidence and arguments that will help me support that belief that I want to have. And so people who are supporters of President Trump will disregard evidence that maybe he's engaged in some wrongdoing, and really embrace evidence that he's doing exactly what they want him to do. And we also call that the my side bias. We tend to really support claims that support our side of an argument, and tend to ignore claims that would maybe undercut our cherished beliefs. But when we look at honesty in politicians, we find that most people want their politicians to be honest. And so, like in large national surveys, when people are asked, how important is it for politicians to be honest, 96% of people say it's either very important or critically important. And so we see that honesty really is valued. But getting back to this my side bias, when Republican voters were asked, how willing would you be to vote for a politician who you knew was a liar? Before Donald Trump was in office, it was about 12% of Republicans said, I would vote for a liar. Once he's in office, that number rises to 55%.
Oh, that's
and
interesting.
So what it suggests is, and I don't think this is anything particular to just Republicans. I think we bend our moral positions on things in order to achieve goals that we want to achieve. And so today I might think that lying is really the worst thing you could do, but if I find out someone very important to me is a liar, then I'm like, well, lying's not that big of a deal. So we are very shifty in that regard.
Shifty is a good word for it. Driven by a kind of whether or not the lies are perceived as being on my side or not. That's a huge variable then that impacts the illusory truth effect. I like that phrase. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, because this just befuddled me. And so what you say is there's a lot of factors that combine to create this illusory truth effect. Well, finally, I know that part of the title of your forthcoming book has to do with how to avoid being duped. And I know that that's a larger question than we have time for in your interview this morning. We'll just have to go get your book in August when it comes out for the full story. But I was hoping that perhaps you could share with us one or two pieces of advice you may have on what we should look out for in order to avoid being duped.
Sure, I'll be brief. One thing is, don't let your emotions get away with you. When people are duped in scams and cons and things, it's usually because they've become emotionally invested in something. They want something. And so it's usually greed, lust, fear, and compassion. Those four things drive people. And so if we can take away emotions, kind of focus on our cold reasoning, we're much more likely to avoid being duped. Another thing is just to notice when we hear someone saying things that are incoherent or inconsistent. 9 times out of 10, if someone is doing and saying things that don't quite add up or don't make sense, they're concealing something.
Yeah.
So if you notice that and probe and dig a little deeper, you're much more likely to discover when someone's being dishonest with you.
That's really helpful. So go rational. And if it doesn't make sense, don't fill in the blanks yourself would be another way to put it, but consider the source and what the motivation might be. And if it's incoherent, then there are some missing links there that you should probably probe for. That is really good advice, Chris. And it's just been very illuminating to listen to you and to learn more about the psychology of liars and lying, our own and other people's. So thank you so much, Chris. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And I really look forward. At this point now, I can't wait for August. And the title, once again, everybody, for Chris's forthcoming book in August is Big Liars, What Psychological Science Tells Us About Lying and How You Can Avoid Being Duped. Chris, thank you so much for taking time to visit us on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me, Mary. I really had a great time talking with you.
Well, me too. It's been totally fun to talk with and to learn from you. Thank you very much, Chris. That's it for today's show, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, be well and be honest. Bye, Chris.
Bye-bye.